I promise I keep it short. So hello everyone and good evening. I'm actually proud to welcome you to tonight's event featuring 3 members of our Penguin Random House family. Our authors, Chimanada and Ngozi. Adichie. Trevor. With Chris Jackson, publisher and editor-in-chief of One World. On behalf of nearly 5,000 writers, translators, and editors of PEN, it's my great pleasure to have you here with us tonight for the 13th annual PEN World Voices Festival of International Literature. I am honored to be a trustee of PEN America, which stands at the intersection of literature and human rights to protect free and open expression here in the US and around the world. We champion the freedom to write, recognizing the power of the word to transform the world. Our mission is, at PEN, to unite writers and their allies to celebrate creative voices and defend the liberties that enable each one to express themselves without fear. At Penguin Random House, we foster healthy discourse and understanding by giving diverse voices, opinions, and ideas a platform and an audience. With that, the goals of PEN and Penguin Random House are very much aligned. For me personally, working with PEN has also been a privilege. As a student of history who grew up in a divided post-war Germany, I am grateful for this matchless opportunity to expand my role as a social activist for free speech and for a society based on equality and fairness. This is no ordinary time for PEN America. We face unprecedented threats to our most important shared values. And your support is more crucial than ever in our fight to protect freedom of expression and the press, defend fact-based discourse, and resist measures that would impair the free flow of ideas and opinions. I encourage you to visit pen.org or one of our info tables outside after the event to learn more about PEN. I'd like to thank our sponsors, the Mayor's Office of Media and Entertainment, and the Village Voices for their support with this event. Thank you all for coming tonight, and a big thank you again to Chimanada, Trevor, and Chris. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Marcus. I hope everyone can hear. And thank you guys for being here. It's such an honor to be here with both of you who I've known for so long and have admired for so long. Actually, Trevor, I haven't known you that long, but we've worked very closely together. So
thank you very much.
We've made up for it in the intensity of our relationship. And I'd like to thank all of you for being here and for also continuing to applaud even after these two are introduced. Even though you have no idea who I am. It is such a beautiful night. There's so much love in the room. It's actually a beautiful night outside as well. So I am going to bring a stinking corpse now onto the stage, which is the results of our recent election. And I bring this up because of, our conversation tonight is going to be about straddling cultural identity and how both of you have done it. And I thought it was really interesting that in the aftermath of the recent election, both of you wrote pieces pretty immediately after the election that got spread around, passed around to people. And it was interesting to me because you were both basically African immigrants to our country, basically. I'm not sure how legal or illegal, but you are here. And you both responded in really interesting ways. So I'm just going to read just a short passage from each of your pieces because I think what I'm curious about is how much of your reaction was, in fact, informed by the cultures you grew up in and the countries you grew up in and that perspective. So Chimanada, you wrote a piece in the New Yorker called "Now is the Time to Talk About What We Are Actually Talking About." Incredibly powerful piece. And you said, "Now is the time to resist the slightest extension in the boundaries of what is right and just. Now is the time to speak up and wear as a badge of honor the opprobrium of bigots. Now is the time to confront the weak core at the heart of America's addiction to optimism. It allows too little room for resilience and too much for fragility. Hazy visions of healing and not becoming the hate we hate sound dangerously like appeasement. The responsibility to forge unity belongs not to the denigrated, but to the denigrators. The premise for empathy has to be equal humanity. It is an injustice to demand that the maligned identify with those who question their humanity." And you started this piece off saying that America has always been aspirational to you. So how much of your reaction to that was informed by this kind of straddling of your cultural identities, do you think?
I think all of it. I don't think of myself as an immigrant in the U.S. I think of myself as a Nigerian who lives in America. And because my sensibilities is, I don't want to say entirely Nigerian, but I do want to say largely shaped by Nigeria. I mean, I didn't leave home to come to the U.S. until I was 19, so I wasn't a child. And I grew up in military dictatorships. I grew up under Generals Buhari, Babangida, Abacha. And so growing up in that kind of political space, I remember being a child and my parents and their friends were talking in our living room, and we had a fairly big house and a large yard, and the doors were closed, and my parents were whispering because they were talking about the government. And I remember thinking, why are they whispering? And it stayed in my mind as an example of what it means to live in a dictatorship. And having come here, I mean, I very quickly realized America's democracy has not ever really been tested. And I think because of that, there's a kind of complacency that can result. And so when the person who's president was elected, it's just so difficult. I mean, after years of seeing President Obama, it's so odd. But anyway,
just say it.
What I was struck by, what I was struck by was how very quickly people, sort of this rush to try and find the bright side, or people started talking about his strategy. People then decided to label what to me was obviously unhinged rantings. People decided to label strategy, and there was a plan behind it, and I just thought there isn't. And I think that it seemed to me that impulse came from just what I think of as this incredible American discomfort with discomfort. Americans don't like to be uncomfortable. And I think it's also linked to this optimism. I mean, on the one hand, there's a lot I admire about that. Right? I think it's the reason people come to this country. If you compare it to the kind of world-weary European, woe is me, the world is dark, it's true. I mean, I think I think that it's obviously, I prefer American optimism, right? But I think it can go too far, and especially when it then has to meet what to me is a dangerous administration. And I just felt really frustrated because I thought this is not the time to take on that American optimism, look at the bright side, we can't be uncomfortable, so we have to, and that piece came in just one mad rush one morning because I think democracy is a very fragile thing. And I think there's certain things that people said would never happen in this country, but they are in fact happening. I don't think that many people thought that this would be a country where people would be scared to travel, to be at the airports. And I have a friend who now everywhere she goes, she has her green card in her bag. And there's something about, for me, that's very sad because, and she said, you just never know. And there's a great sadness there because carrying your green card everywhere with you, apart from the impracticality of it, because if you lose it, it's a terrible process to, get it back. But also it says something about this person's view of a new America. And it seemed to me that it's important to push back at that, and that one of the things that was important to do was to just drop that idea that we can't be uncomfortable, we have to be optimistic all the time. There's very little cause for optimism.
Right. 3 days later, Trevor wrote a piece that was also in the New York Times Magazine, actually, and he said, "I grew up under the harsh racial oppression of apartheid as a person of mixed ethnicity. The lines between black and white were clearly drawn and enforced with guns and tanks. But because I am neither black nor white, I was forced to live between those lines. I was forced to communicate across those lines. I was forced to learn how to approach people and problems with nuance. If I hadn't, I wouldn't have survived. America, I found, doesn't like nuance. Either black people are criminals or cops are racist. Pick one. It's us versus them. You're with us or you're against us. This national mentality is fueled by the hysteria of a 24-hour news cycle, by the ideological silos of social media, and by the structure of the country's politics." So in the aftermath of the election, I mean, you too actually thought of America as being, and it's so clear in your book, in some of the episodes you write about, as being an aspirational place.
Right.
Did the election shift that for you as well?
I think where I differ slightly from Chimanada is I agree with the aspiration. I don't think that negates the ability of a nation or a people to take multiple steps backwards. You know,
Right.
My mom always used to say to me, life will continue to teach you a lesson until you learn it. And the ultimate lesson will be death. And she used to say that to me, talking just about being a young man of color, growing up in a world where the police could instantly take your life.
Right.
You know, she always said that to me. She said, learn the lesson now from me when I'm the authority figure before there is another that you have to deal with. And so I think when I looked at the US post the election, I struggled to hold on to the narrative that there shouldn't be optimism because I look at numbers. I agree with you completely when you say America is a place where, you know, I guess the truth sort of came out in a way that many people weren't comfortable with. But then I also look at the numbers and I look at the relics that in many ways Donald Trump has exposed in America's democracy. You know, I said a similar thing. I said Donald Trump is the stress test of America's democracy. Sometimes you don't realize where your roof is leaking until a major storm comes. And in that moment, I don't know, maybe it's just me. I'm not the kind of person who goes, well, I'm going to move now. I say, well, now it's time to start thinking of how to patch this roof because I don't believe it'll rain forever. And so when I look at Donald Trump and look at post-election, I go, I still have to look at the numbers. I still have to look at more Americans voting for Hillary. Now, that's something that's still something that sticks with me as I go, I can't just ignore the fact that 3 million more people voted for this person. I can't ignore that. I can't ignore the fact that it's some complicated electoral system that's a slave holdover that gave Donald Trump the victory. You know, I struggle to grapple with that idea. And I think that idea of mine has been reinforced, you know, in this post 100 days of Donald Trump, because I go, here is a nation where many people, I agree, were complacent. And yet now I see people who, like myself at many times, have felt we don't know how to help or what to do, but people are doing things. I've seen, you know, hundreds of thousands of women marching, hundreds of thousands of men joining them on marches. I've seen people marching and fighting for what they believe in, engaging with their politicians. I mean, I saw Americans protecting Muslims in an airport while they prayed. That's something I never thought I'd see in my entire life. After 9/11, to have Muslims in the airport, Americans standing around them. And I know someone might be like, oh yeah, but that's a small, but that's not a small thing for me. That is a moment where people in that aspirational moment saw themselves as maybe being better or trying to be better. And what I do appreciate is sometimes the gift and the curse of optimism. But for me, the gift mostly of optimism is it almost tricks you into trying to be better, or it tricks you into trying to get to that place. And although you may not always achieve that, I do see signs and glimmers of hope. And I guess that's why I wrote my piece in the way I did. And I think some people misunderstand it because they think you're saying all people must come together. I'm not naive to think that will ever happen, right? There are certain people where, as you say, you will change the policies before they change their hearts. And that's what a good nation and a government should do, in my opinion. But I do feel like there are divisions that come from the trauma of a loss. And what happens is an infighting occurs. And that's what I was speaking about post the election. is the divisions that happen within that group that voted against Donald Trump. Within that group, people now go, this is your fault that we lost. No, it's your fault that we lost. And people are going like, yeah, but let's not focus on the person that won now, because that's the issue.
Right.
Yes, we've got to keep on working on these fissures that we have, and they may become, they may become greater now that this has happened. But at the same time, this is not the time to be divided. And maybe I do go back to South Africa, where at some point, the ANC, COSATU, the IFP, everyone had to say, okay, we have a common enemy. We have to figure out how we're going to defeat the apartheid government. And as much as we don't agree on small ideas, we have to figure out how that thing that oppresses all of us will be defeated. And that's really the idea that came to my mind post the election was, if people aren't careful, when the next election comes, it's not that Donald Trump will be unbeatable, it's that no one will agree on who should beat him. And then you'll be surprised into 2 terms a lot quicker, because on Donald Trump's side, as they've showed, 90% of his supporters still go, yeah, this guy's doing a fantastic job. And so that side is not shaky at all. People need to work on the unity of their side, is what I always talk about.
So I thought it was interesting what you said, Chimanada, just about your own sense of your identity as being not an African immigrant, but as a Nigerian who lives in Africa, in America. What is the distinction?
I forgot the last bit. Who lives in America part of the year?
Part of the year. Let's be totally clear. All right.
It's true, though, because I have 2 homes. I live in
Right.
Lagos as well. Yeah. Yeah.
Right. So,
I think it's important, because I do think that there's a perspective that it gives me, and I think I lived my entire life in the U.S. and I thought of myself as an immigrant, I think maybe I would see things slightly differently. I think there's also a kind of, when I'm back home, and because I spent back home in Lagos, I have 2 homes, you kind of look, when I'm in Lagos, I look at the U.S. in a different way, and there's a kind of distance that it affords me. And I think it's the same when I'm in the U.S. I look at Nigeria in a different way, and I think it shapes the way that I think about these things. I mean, so one of the reasons that I bristled when I read Trevor's piece in the New York Times was because it made me think that we were sort of doing this Pollyanna-ish, let's all get, and it felt, and I respect the sentiment behind it, right? That sort of, that kind of, and also respect it, really. But it just seemed to me, to put it into context, right? So the American president made himself relevant, actually, before he started running for president. Let's remember that he made himself relevant by mounting this utterly racist campaign called Betherism, which really was just simply a racist campaign to delegitimize America's first black president. That's how he made himself relevant. And then he runs for office, and in that running and in the campaign, he manages to speak about women in the most just horrendous way, talk about immigrants in just simplistic, dehumanizing ways. And it just seemed to me odd that he wins, and suddenly we're being told, try and understand him, let's heal, and I just thought, no. We shouldn't be, because there's something about it, but also it just seemed to me unjust, right? That people whose humanity had been questioned were suddenly being told, now it's your job to A, understand this man, B, give him a chance, C, and I just thought, no. And one of the wonderful
Just to be clear, though, I wasn't that person.
No, you weren't. So you weren't.
Just so you know.
No, you weren't. No, you
She's
weren't.
not talking about me right now.
No, of course not, of course not.
Just so we're on the same page.
No. No, I'm not at all suggesting that you weren't. No, Trevor wasn't at all. No. And I mean, and I hear what you say, but so that and I think it's changed a bit. I mean, I wrote my piece, I think it was maybe 2 weeks after he won, and it seemed to me that sort of the American media and people who were talking about it just weren't sure what the hell to do and to say, because I think most people didn't think he would win. And in many ways, neither did he. So there was a sense in which there was kind of a sense of, what the hell are we supposed to do about this? And suddenly there was, the kind of talk that was coming out just really made me feel that this was not the way to go. And one of the wonderful things I think about a democracy is that resistance in a democracy is a good thing, right? That dissent is a wonderful thing. And I think it's happening now. I mean, I think that 100 days in, I see it. I don't see that sense of, I don't see a lot of what I found myself reacting to when I wrote that piece. I live in Maryland, and just in the small community where I live, there are all of these sort of small political meetings happening in people's homes. You know, I keep being invited to them. You know, come and let's talk about the Republican congressperson that we're going to unseat. You know, people are just really, and that I think is what a democracy should be. And there are many people in this country who haven't been active in any way, who have become active. And I think it's a response to, in some ways, it's the kind of response I wish had happened from day one. But of course, it's America, right? You sort of have to claw through the curdled layers of ridiculous optimism.
But I think if I may interject that, I think essentially maybe that's where my response comes from, is that on The Daily Show, I'm really blessed to have a staff that comprises of a wide range of people, different walks of life, you know, different backgrounds, just a group of people who come together to help create this show. And one thing that I like about that is it enables me to not just live in my space, but in a tiny community that I'm a part of every single day. And the one thing I noticed immediately after the election was a change. I noticed a shift in people's perspective. I noticed a shift in people's determination. I noticed a physical change. You know, I remember one of my female writers turned to me and she said, "I feel like my country has betrayed me." And she looked at me and she said, "Now, we change now, right? This show changes." And I said, "Yes, because now we have a purpose." And so for myself, that purpose changed. When I started on the show, people were like, "Why aren't you angry?" I said, "Well, what am I angry at? Please explain this to me." I said, I do not just have anger to throw around. What am I angry at? I will not fake outrage, because there are many things that I don't believe are outrageous. Especially, America lives in the sides. So if one side does it, the other side has to be outraged. If the other side does it, the other side has to. But I go, "But why are you outraged by that? Tell me why." Because, and then half of the time you can find that the other side did it 10 years previously when they're administrating. So I try and throw all of that away. I go, get rid of that frivolity. What are you outraged about? What should you be angry about? And those are the moments where I feel as a human being that it is worth getting worked up and having the energy. But what I noticed in my staff and in myself and the people was a galvanizing of a spirit. And so when I wrote the piece, I went, if this can happen in my tiny world, then this can happen in the larger world that I live in, which is the United States of America. And so it is an optimism, because I go, a guy like Donald Trump, what he does is he makes you wake up. He makes you fight. He makes you find the best in yourself. And sometimes you can't find that until you are pressed. You know, it's the reason when a person works out, they have to push themselves. That's when growth happens, is when you're outside of your comfort zone.
And so mine hasn't been working out.
and so essentially I go like, Donald Trump is he's now put America and the world out of its comfort zone. You know, don't forget, before Donald Trump, China was like, global warming, climate change, meh. Donald Trump came in and said, okay, it's real, like, we're gonna fight. All of a sudden, President Xi was leading the charge. This is a person who never even came to these climate agreements beforehand. This is a nation, like before that, people were like, we'll see what now nations standing up in the world, the Netherlands saying, we're gonna donate money to helping women around the world. We're going to step up, we're going to become something. And sometimes it is that force that attacks you that will make you become the best version of yourself, because otherwise you just sit around and you become complacent.
Right, so he's sort of like a personal trainer to the world.
He is, unfortunately.
Right, based on his vast experience with personal trainers, I'm sure. So, Chimanada, you said a really interesting thing about how being in two different places, living in two different places, gives you a kind of perspective on the other place. And it's interesting when I think about the sort of trajectory of your fiction, in particular, like you wrote novels that took place entirely in Nigeria, and then with Americana, you wrote a novel that takes place all over the world. Was that partly a function of your sort of living in different parts of the world and having more experience and more, I guess, being more conversant with?
Yeah, I guess. I mean, it's easy to write about places that you've been to.
Right.
So when I wrote, and also because it just seemed, it's very hard for me to in talking about fiction, it's very hard for me to intellectualize choices and things because half the time I don't actually know. Right. So I think that with Americana, the story called me. Just felt I wanted to write about. I wanted to write something, the present. I wanted to write to the present. I wanted to write this contemporary thing about love, obviously, but also it's the kind of African immigration that I'm familiar with, because I think that the narrative that is common in the Western world about African immigrants is that they're fleeing poverty and war and catastrophe, and obviously those stories are important, but it never feels familiar to me because it's not the story I know. And I wanted to write about the people who are not dying, who haven't been caught up in any war, but who are dreaming of more, and for whom more is America, actually. Well, I don't know about now, but at least. And also that story of the African who, in his or her country, isn't hungry, eats well, probably even has a job, but makes the choice to leave, and suddenly is washing toilets in London, and what that is, and how it shapes who you are and your relationship with your peers. And I wanted to try and capture that because it's very familiar to me. It's the story of the people I know and love. And it came obviously from sort of being familiar with that because I've lived in this country for quite a few years off and on, and I've spent time in England, and I have family in England. And so the research part was fairly easy. Actually, my sister-in-law, who has a very sharp mouth, she said to me, next time if you want to write about us, just use our real name. And I was like, wait, what?
So Trevor, how about for you? You obviously started your career in South Africa,
right?
And you became a star in South Africa, but then you became a star in other parts of the world, around the world, and now you're here. Has that changed your storytelling as a comedian?
Well, I think every country has a flavor to it. Every country has an idea and a theme that almost dictates what the country, defines itself as. And so, traveling the world, one thing that I was always blessed with is when I traveled, as simple as it sounds, I just learned more of myself. Because I always knew myself in my world. I always knew what ideas I had in my world. And only when those ideas were tested or applied in different places did I come to change or modify them. Did I come to see places and people and ideas as a totally different thing. First traveling the Commonwealth and seeing the similarities, of the British Empire as it was. And then going to countries that had no history that was tied to mine, in a direct way. Coming to the US, though, was a strange experience because it's a weirdly familiar place for me, because it feels sort of like home, but not. It's like America and South Africa are almost like parallel universes. It's like an episode of Black Mirror where it could have been. So, South Africa, a country where black people were oppressed. America, a country black people were and still are oppressed. And then you look at the shift, but the difference was in South Africa, black people were the ones who then assumed power. And now that didn't shift everything overnight. I mean, we're still struggling with the effects of poverty, and those things may take generations to fix. And now there's new issues like corruption, etc., that come up. But it was a different journey, and it is a different journey. And then you come to the US, and it's very similar, but then the people and the numbers who are being oppressed changes. And that changes your perspective of how you see yourself and how you see the world. And, I was lucky enough that I came from a place where when I left South Africa to come and live in the US, I had experienced blackness in all its forms in terms of like, black didn't just mean one thing to me. So black had no connotation per se. I went, black can be late, black can be on time. Black.
Wait, hold on, Trevor. Where in the world is black on time?
Black in South Africa. in South Africa.
Come on.
And so I went, I went, black can be poor, black can be rich. I went, black can be a criminal, black can be the judge. And so I was lucky in that when I left, and that's something I feel sad for a lot of South Africans who fled the country, because they feared, what was going to happen to them post-apartheid. But they never got to see that. So many people just go, I have one image of black people and that's it. But I left with that. And then I came to America, and then I realized very quickly I had to shift how people saw black people, how I was perceived, how I was perceiving what I thought I was perceiving. And that shift in my world changed. It was the same when I went to the UK, seeing how black people associated with everyone else in the UK, and realizing that classism is at times more powerful than race, but race is still a huge factor there. And then you come to the US and it becomes like race is really one of the biggest things. Even with money, it still becomes one of the biggest things. And so that journey for me was one that I think cut a lot of the fat that I always used to have in my mind in terms of thinking of ideas. A lot of these ideas are learned because they come from a place. A lot of these ideas and rules are fixed because they're fixed in one place. But you travel from one country to another, you realize what is offensive there is not offensive here. You realize what is seen as oppressive here is not oppressive there. You realize, but then you see, once you cut away the fat, you see the truth of everything. You start to realize more and more of the connective tissues. And then I was in a space where I was like, oh, okay, this I know from South Africa. This could even be a precursor to what may happen in America. And that's why from the beginning I said, I think Donald Trump can win. He was all too familiar for me. I saw this man on TV and I went, he's charismatic. Whether you like him or hate him, he knows how to command the camera. And Hillary was someone who, in her own words, even said she's a horrible politician in that way. And America loves entertainment and loves, the show of it all. And I came from a country where our leaders are still charismatic and they connect with the people. And then my one president who was kicked out was someone who was a policy wonk and didn't connect with the people, and he was just focused on doing the job and not the show around the job. And so that piece of traveling shaped how I saw the world. So, for instance, when I saw that, I went, oh, wow, oh, you guys are in trouble. And people said, oh, you're being stupid. This is what happens to us every year. It's silly summer. We calm down. And then we get, we make our minds up in the winter. And I said, that thing there is going to do well. Like, I can see how it can connect. And over time, I guess, people sort of came around to what I was saying. But in the end, I think my travels shaped and still shape the way I see the world.
It's interesting, when I remember I saw Chimanada, you speaking with Ta-Nehisi Coates in Washington a couple of months ago, and one of the things that Ta-Nehisi and I have actually talked about many times about one of the things we love about Americana is that it does feel like it's a book that has an element of sort of Pan-Africanism about it, because it takes these different parts of the diaspora, particularly America and in Nigeria, and it shows that both like places where they connect in this most magical way, and in places where they are each kind of observing each other from a distance. So do you believe that there is, like, based just on your experience living in Africa, living here, that there is some kind of a Pan-African unity that exists between cultures throughout the diaspora?
Yes. I do. I mean, I do. I think, I'm very curious about black people being on time. Trevor and I will talk about it later. But I think if you go, one of the things I've observed in traveling and just observing, I feel as though there's, and again, when you're looking at it historically, 100 years really isn't that long. And African American history didn't start on a slave ship. It started in Africa. And black people in the Caribbean are people of Africa. Black people in Brazil are people of Africa. Black people in Europe and it's not just about skin color. I mean, I believe very strongly that there are cultural traditions that have been passed down, have been diluted as they should be. But there are things there. There are strands there. There are things there. And I think of myself politically as Pan-African, and it's sort of my political worldview is quite Pan-African. And what that means, I don't really know. It just means that I care about what's happening in Kenya, and I care about what's happening in, you know, I care about what's happening to people in the Bahia region of Brazil. I'm interested. I'm interested in the way that certain Yoruba traditions have survived in Brazil. And I'm interested in you know, Afro-Colombians. I'm interested, and I think I'm interested because there's a familiarity there. There's something that I feel connected to. I don't think I mean, it's nice to think of Americana as Pan-African, and I don't know that I necessarily sat down and thought, I shall now write a Pan-African tome. but because my worldview is Pan-African, it doesn't surprise me that it is. It's the way, it's about, for me, about the ways in which we connect and the ways in which we don't connect. I mean, for me, coming here, and I've talked about this often, about discovering that I was black when I came to the US, and in some ways, I think Trevor and I have such different experiences because we grew up in such different parts of Africa. The South Africa is as removed as it possibly can be from Nigeria. That I think growing up in South Africa, and in some ways in Southern Africa, is to be aware of race as a present reality in your life. To grow up in West Africa, particularly Anglophone West Africa, is to be completely oblivious of race. Very much aware of ethnicity and religion, but race. And so I still have friends in Nigeria who, when they talk about race, I cringe because, and I do because obviously there's something in me that has become Americanized. I've understood race as America understands race. And I also think that that's a different understanding of race. I mean, that there's a particular thing about the way America looks at race. And I should also maybe clarify that usually in this case I'm talking about blackness. Because again, obviously there are different races and different forms of oppression in this country. And I don't want to go into a rant about my problems with the American left, but often there's a need to have this sort of united league of the oppressed. And I think it's a very dishonest way of having conversations because I think that people experience oppression in different ways. So I'm talking about blackness. I just want to clarify, right? Because, you know, Hispanics have oppression. It's different. You know, Asian Americans, never mind that minority, model minority thing, also experience oppression, right? But so in talking about blackness, when I came to the US, I discovered I was black. And it was a kind of strange thing because, you know, with the sort of casual arrogance that most Nigerians are bred with, the Nigerians here know this is true, let's be honest, right? So see, we're owning it, it's ridiculous. This is what I mean, right? We're just like, yeah. And so I remember sort of coming here, and and it's a very small moment, but I was in class. It was the first essay we wrote, undergrad. The professor comes in. This is sort of when, I don't know if physical papers are still things that people bring to class, but he's like, who wrote this essay? This is the best essay, and I want to know who wrote it. And I raised my hand, and he looked surprised. And it was a very small, fleeting moment, but that's when I realized he didn't think the person who wrote this essay was black. And with my Nigerian sort of, I was just like, what? You know, I thought, does he not know I'm Nigerian and that we're all brilliant in Nigeria? But really, I mean, no, but really, but just to say that it was kind of a learning thing. And then I went through this process of wanting to run away from that label. And I recognize now that what it was of blackness, where I would say I'm not black, I'm Nigerian. I did this for maybe a year of my time in the US, and looking back now, I recognize it as, in some ways, even that, my reaction is an indictment of American racism, because obviously I'm black, but because I realized that America's understanding of black was so loaded with negativity, I thought, no, I don't want to, you know, I don't know. And I remember when people would say, oh, come to Black Students Union, I'll be like, nope. I will be going to the library, you know. And so, but then I started to read, and it's important for me to talk about this because it's so important to, I mean, especially as we're now in this age of alternative facts, that it's so important to read, I mean, the facts of American history, and there's no way, I think, that any open-minded person can read the facts of American history and just not acknowledge the massive, unending injustice of blackness in this country. And so and it was a political choice to take on the label of black. Like, I'm very happily black, and I like to talk about how I lived in Brooklyn for a few months when I first came here, and there was an African-American man who once called me a sister. This was the very early months, and I was like, I'm not your sister. Nope. I was like, look, I know, but you know, I talk about this honestly. Many people do this and don't talk about it. Right. I mean, I think that black immigrants in this country, there's that path, and I don't think of it as necessarily an indictment of them. It's about it's about this country. I mean, it's that immigrants come here, they want to survive, they want to do well, they absorb the terrible negative stereotypes. They're not really armed with facts. They haven't really read the history. Many of them haven't been educated here. And they just kind of buy into it. So I was like, no, I'm not your sister. And so after I had done a bit of reading, I just felt so ashamed. And I wanted to find him and be like, I am so your sister, right? I'm like, take me back, you know. But yeah.
So, Trevor, did you have the same, I mean, in a somewhat different way, discovery of, or shift in like how you felt racially identified when you came here?
Well, I was lucky in that, I mean, it's a weird thing to say you're lucky with, but in South Africa, because of that oppression, I was used to that idea. I was used to a label. I was used to knowing that I'm below. I was used to having or suffering from a racial low self-esteem, which is something that many South Africans have had and still have. So for instance, you know, in South Africa, it's a common thing, and I know there's some parts of Africa that have this depending on their history, but like in South Africa, if you would drive a nice car, you know, into a gas station or a petrol station, you know, then the attendant may say to you, Mlungu, you know, which means, the white man. You know, and that basically would imply, look at you, you're doing well, you have achieved whiteness. You know, look at you, things are going well. And so white goes well, black does not. You know, and so when something would be negative, it would just be something that people would say as a throwaway thing. It would be like, hey, Mandaki, which was just like, oh, you know, what, like black people, like, what are you going to say? And I didn't realize this was a thing. You don't realize that you have a stigma of yourself until you read, until you tackle it. And so the one thing that we had was, as I said earlier, the levels. So as much as you had the stigma, you went, yeah, but I can aspire to that level of the whiteness. I can live in the white area. I can drive the white man's car. I can speak the language like the white man. Because for so long, that determined your success in South Africa. You know, in many ways, it still does for some people. And so it's funny, I had Nigerian friends in South Africa, and I remember I met them because there was an influx that came in and stayed, you know, and when I stayed in Hillbrow, I was friends with a lot of Nigerians. And I was always shocked at how confident Nigerians were. You know, I used to watch Nigerian movies with my Nigerian friends, and I was like, these things are horrible. I was like, why aren't you watching Hollywood movies? And I remember my friend would turn to me, you know, and he would say to me, say, why can't I watch that movie, huh? What time I watching on that TV?
That is a terrible
idea. And he would go, he said, what my favorite thing he used to say, because it would be like a white actress on screen, and I forget how he said it exactly, but he used to say something along the lines of, he'd be like, that lady can't do nothing for me, huh? And I didn't understand it, but he was like, no, I watch our movies and our stories and our music is what we celebrate. And I had never seen this. I was like, what? But in my world, you aspire to the English. In my world, you aspire to that thing. And so when I came to America, it wasn't learning that I was black. It was rather coming into a space where I realized it was like the bridging of the gap. So if Nigerians have excessive confidence and
which
South
by the way
Africans,
has its pitfalls. Let's not.
but I mean, and then you know, South Africans have a slightly diminished one. I remember when I came to the U.S., I was shocked at how some of the things that I had aspired to were frowned upon in some places. I remember when I first did comedy, and there was a really great comedian, still a friend of mine in L.A., and I did a show, and I did a show at an all-black comedy show. It was called Chocolate Sundays. And they asked me to come on, and they were like, and I mean, the introduction was just like, it was like, yo, man, hey, man, we got this brother from South Africa, yo, we got this dude, he flew all the way here, man, yo, this dude, we got to show him some love, we got to do, and I was like, wow, but the guy was really, really, you know, and I walked on stage, and the people looked at me like I was now going to introduce the guy from Africa, and I started speaking. And I'll never forget this. No one laughed. No one laughed. They just stared at me. There was one person laughing in the balcony. It was Cat Williams. I'll never forget it. It was Cat Williams. And he was the only person who was laughing at my jokes. And I got off the stage and I was like, well, that was the most horrible experience ever. And the host got back on. And then I guess he voiced the feeling of the audience. And he turned and he was like, hey, man. He's like, yo, I ain't gonna front. He's like, I know they got yellow bones in Africa, man. And he's like, shit. He's like, that nigga came on stage, yo, he was talking like the Queen and shit, man. He's like, yo, good evening. He's like, yo, where the fuck was Mutombo, man? And I was like, wait, what? What do you... And I was like, what do you... And I then understood. And I was like, oh, wow, this is that thing. And you know, I initially... My pride and you know a certain amount of fear goes like, well, I will be more of this. I will show you that this is a thing. And I did a show, and a friend of mine, Chris Spence, I'll never forget after the show. It was a good show, but he came up to me and he said to me, hey man, I like that you play black rooms because a lot of comedians that do the mainstream rooms in America don't do the black rooms. And he said, but just be careful of one thing, because people don't know you, they might see you as an uppity nigga. And I said, what does that mean? And he says...
When was this happening?
And he said, this was maybe, 6 years ago. And he said to me, be careful that some people may perceive you as being someone who does not want to be associated with black because of how you speak, because of how you dress, because of how they see you. And in that moment, I was like, but what does that mean? What is that? And he's like, well, the way you use your words and the way, you know, that's not seen for some people as a black thing. And that's when I came to realize that a lot of the negative stereotypes, it's very familiar to me because we've done it in South Africa and it's done in the US, is that black people, and I don't know if it's in, you know, the pursuit of really forming a buttress of your culture and your mind, have unfortunately absorbed some of the negative elements that have just been associated with blackness because of its oppression. And so now people go, yeah, being ignorant is black. You know, spending my money the way I spend it is black. You know, whether it's baby mama jokes, whether it's like, these are things that are black. These are things that are part of my blackness, as opposed to going, no, there is this culture that we all experience. There is a culture of who we are. And then there are incidental things that have been imposed on us because of our skin, because of our culture, because of our heritage. And because it's happened for so long, we've come to believe that that is a part of who we are. And I still have to work to shake that every day, you know, and I see it in my friends, and it's something that we work to shake every day, but I go, no, actually, that is not something that I'm proud of, and you won't get that out of me. You know, when people go, stop acting white, and I go, but what are you saying? What do you mean by stop acting white? Why are you giving that to white people if it's a positive thing? It's not, they don't own it. Do you know what I'm saying?
Right. Mm-hmm.
That's not their thing. So don't be tricked into owning the negative. Mm-hmm. And that's essentially what I discovered when I got here. But it was a realization because I had a bit of it in South Africa, and then it was an even bigger awakening when I came to the US. Mm-hmm. And then if I may add, one real quick thing was, I guess the biggest awakening for me was, it wasn't in a negative way, it was rather the other. And that is, I've always loved celebrating different cultures because South Africa is really such a melting pot. And, you know, whether it was my Nigerian friends, or whether it was my Zimbabwean friends, or even in South Africa, Xhosa, Zulu, Tswana, Pedi, Afrikaans, whatever, I was enjoying that. And I'll never forget when I did shows in America, and because I formed my comedy in black rooms, that was what I was working with, and that's what I enjoyed. And I'll never forget the first time I took it out of a black room and I went to a white audience and I did the same jokes. And it destroyed, but even bigger and in a strange way. And I didn't understand why, what was happening, or, you know. And it took me too long, in my opinion. I mean, it's a short amount of time in life, but it took me too long to realize that in the black room, we were laughing at our thing. When I went to the white room, I was giving them the license to laugh at the black thing. Mm-hmm. And I honestly didn't realize it, you know. I used to make jokes about, you know, names like, you know, Shaniqua and you know, and I was like, it's funny. Mm-hmm. It's funny. I mean, it's the same way back home I'll tease my cousin, Nomatamsanga, and I'll always tease her I'd call her Rice Krispies because I was like, there's always popping sounds, but she didn't take that it was just like because of your name specifically. My mom doesn't have click sounds in her name, but when I realized that, I was like, oh wow, there are so many levels here, and I have to be careful now of what I share where, because where you give it away may create a completely different connotation of what you're giving away.
Amen.
So now that's a really great point. And I wonder, for both of you, and I think this is one of the interesting things about artists like both of you who have global audiences, right?
Trevor, we should record that and send it to all the white people who say, well, black people say the N-word, why can't I say the N-word?
Absolutely. Well, exactly. So now, as a writer and as a performer and writer who speak to these multiple audiences, do you feel like you, in some ways, have to be aware of audience when you're writing about different cultures? Do you feel in some ways like there is that you're speaking for a group of people? Do you feel like you're having to maybe even strip what you write for export, so to speak, so that people everywhere can get it?
No, and in particularly in fiction, no. When I'm writing nonfiction, it's very different, and it's a very different creative process. With nonfiction, if I write essays, I generally know I suppose I'd like to think I know what I'm doing. Right. And so in some ways, I'm aware of audience. I mean, obviously, when I wrote that piece for The New Yorker, I knew that I was writing for a primarily American audience. I think most Nigerians will read it and just be like, whatever. Which I think they did, actually, that I don't know what the hell she's talking about. But with fiction, I don't. And because fiction is the thing I love and what I think of as my life's vocation, I don't. And in some ways, it's become something that I'm increasingly conscious of not doing. In other words, because I'm aware of, it's this strange thing of being fortunate to be read, but also it coming with baggage. And some of the baggage is saying to myself, I don't ever want to get to the point where the storytelling that I do is shaped by any other consideration that is not my artistic vision. I don't want to get there. I mean, I have a pact with my dear friend Binyavanga Wainaina. I said to him, when I start writing that, kill me. And he said yes, he will. So, but in general, no, I don't. And I think, I think the integrity of a story is very important. And so, I want to tell my story the way it is. And I know that, for example, the way that I throw in Igbo words in my fiction, I have had many editors who think that maybe I should tone it down or take it out or, use names that are simpler for Americans. And I just think no, because I grew up reading books set in Russia with long names I couldn't pronounce. It didn't get in the way of my connecting with the characters. And I take that all the time with me, that there's a sense in which literature is a universal language because it is specific, right? And so and maybe that's why, sometimes I'm just really surprised that people in Japan are reading me, and I'm like, really? Maybe for me, it's also proof that you don't have to, that especially with fiction. I think, and as a reader, I know that the books I'm drawn to are the books that are very steeped in their specificity, in the books that don't sort of carry around any fairy ideas of universal. I mean, I'm always very troubled when people start to say, oh, but you're universal, and I start worrying because universal can often mean that you've stripped your work of the things that really make it.
Right.
I had somebody who very kindly suggested, for example, that since I had become well-known in America, it might be a good idea not to use the difficult name in my most recent book. My book is called Adichie Awele. It's a name that's difficult even for Nigerian Igbo people to pronounce. But it's a name I love, and I was like, nope, that's the name we're using, right? I mean, does it mean some nice person in Iowa won't buy it because the name is scary? Maybe, but I can live with that. I mean.
And Trevor, how do you feel about that? Do you feel like there's a degree to which you do you feel like you have to go to the specific to reach the broadest audiences? Even in South Africa, you spoke to you performed in front of audiences of different kinds.
Right. I think as a comedian, you're always conscious of your audience. What happened, though, was, I guess, through the internet and a world accessing me before I even knew it had, my specificity came to become what I was talking about all the time. And so, I agree. No, I agree with what you're saying in that you shouldn't try to be global, if that makes sense. But I go, but who you are is who you are. So I would argue as Chimamanda, you are global because of who you are. You know what I mean? You don't have to try. And there's some people who are trying to be global, which is why they lose it. But if everyone connects with your story, or if many people do, you're global whether you like it or not. You know, it doesn't mean that you are. I understand people run away from being like, oh, that means I'm stripped or commercial. Or I get that.
No, I'm not. Oh, I have to say, I'm actually not precious about. I would love to be commercial.
No, but I get what I'm saying.
I was raised in an Igbo household. There's no Igbo person who does not love that word commercial.
That's funny.
I'm perfectly happy with commercial. But I know what you mean.
Yeah. So what I'm saying is, when it comes to being global, I go like, no, but that's who I am. So I go, I'm Trevor Noah, who grew up in South Africa. I had the opportunity to go to a school that was at a point white and then changed, and then we were the first group of mixed children who were allowed into the school. So I'm shaped by a piece of that. I have access to a world that maybe some people don't, but that is a piece of me now. The same thing with my mother. My mother has a grasp of languages that she then bequeathed upon me, and now I try to mirror what she did, but that is a piece of me. And then, you know, having a father from Switzerland who is white, that shaped a piece of me. And then having a stepfather who was black, it shaped a piece. So everything connected. So then I go, that is my specificity, is that I am touched and, you know, in some way connected to everything and everyone. And it's also because I come from a country where that was a thing. We were all corralled into that group, and so what happens then is the people mix up the ideas. Our languages grew, our forms of communication are so interlinked in South Africa that we've created languages upon languages, you know, within themselves. And so when I tell stories, I don't write fiction, but for the book, as you know, as the editor, the specificity was exactly what I was going for, because I've always believed that the specificity is what's global. I think it's the other way around. I almost go like, that is like the real thing that everyone connects with. I was listening to Dolly Parton and Kenny Rogers when I was a little kid because my mom would play the music. At no point did I say to myself, whoa, who are these white people singing? I didn't even know that they were white. I just heard the music, and it was love, and they were singing a story, and my mother was singing it, and so I was hearing it and I was singing it with her. And she was connecting with certain things. Maybe she wouldn't have connected with a song that was about Texas, but she connected with the specificity of someone falling in love and that story that was being told. And so when I tell these stories, I think of the audience the way I think of my friends. I go, how would I share this with you? What do I want to tell you? What do I feel I need to share with you to give you a glimpse into who I am or how I think? And I know with my friends I'm my most vulnerable, and at the same time I'm also the most willing to learn and share. I'm in a space where my friends get the best of me. And so with every audience, whether it's on stage or whether it's in a book, I go, I will think of you as that person and give you the best of me. And the worst of me as well, because if I do that and you accept me, if you accept me for the worst of me, then we have a great friendship ahead of us. And if you don't accept me because of the worst of me, then we shouldn't have been friends to begin with. And so that's what I pursue all of the time. And I think I've been lucky enough that my specificity is that I've been touched by everything and everyone in my world. And that's what I try and talk about without forcing it.
I do think, though, I mean, just listening to that one of the things I've kind of discovered in the publishing world, and you, of course, are an esteemed member of that world, is that there's also a lot that is power and privilege have a lot to do. They kind of breed a kind of entitlement for people who belong to groups that are powerful, who then think that only their stories are universal, and who are surprised when. So I, for example, have often heard from people who seem genuinely surprised that they connected with my characters. And when I was growing up reading Enid Blyton, it never occurred to me not to connect with her characters, because I didn't grow up with a certain kind of entitlement that my world was kind of the only world allowed to be universal. And I've also heard from some men, God bless them, who also say that they're surprised that, you know, I really liked Half of a Yellow Sun. And they're kind of surprised that they liked it because, you know, a woman wrote the book. And so just to say that there is that as well, I think. And I think it's something that is important to talk about, particularly for young writers starting out. I think that young writers who are from not just parts of the world, but groups, right, that are on the margins, are often told that in their writing they have to sort of give the reader some form of entry, which often means a kind of toning down of their specificity. Because, and as a reader, when I read some of these stories, I can tell that someone's been meddling, right? And there's something about, there's a sadness to it for me, and something that increasingly I think about, because we still don't live in a world, I don't think, where there's just that natural assumption that everybody's story matters equally. We still don't. I mean, there's, yeah.
I will say that just real quick off that, one thing that I do think is important, though, is to acknowledge that sometimes you can clarify or try and help a story connect with someone without losing some of that specificity. And maybe that's because I come from a world where we have 11 official languages in South Africa. My life, I grew up with translators. It's the only world I know. And this was even in the black community. We would go to church, and there would be 3 pastors on stage, and they would all be preaching the same word, and they were basically, you know, whoever was the main pastor, the other 2 would translate what the person was saying. So if the first one would start out and say, Jesus loves all of you, the next one would say, Jesu uyandithanda nonke, and then the next one would say, Modimo ulirata kaofela, and it's like you were like, oh, I pick up on that, what that guy said, I'll pick up on that. But now I understood all of the languages, so I just heard the sermon 3 times. But what I found was very...
But they're saying the same thing.
Yes, definitely. But what I found was, I was like, oh, there are ways where you can use language and you can use little stories that help you connect and identify with my specificity. I don't need to pander to you, but it's the reason we use language. You know, it's the reason you can choose to write a book in a language, the reason you can choose to have a movie with subtitles or a movie that is dubbed. You can choose how you want to tell that story. And so I find in that, I think maybe that is what I consider, is I say, if you can completely not understand the story, if it does not connect you in any way because of not an idea, but rather a word that maybe won't be a name, like just a thing that doesn't exist in your world, it's hard for me to just carry on from that. I would rather now just give you that little bit of knowledge and go, this is what this is, this is what we use it for, and now you just have that thing. And I go, if you know it, now you know it, and then we can move on from there. But I just tell you, hey, in South Africa, so mopani worms, for instance, I'm just going to tell you what a mopani worm is. If I say to you, growing up in South Africa...
But that's because you're assuming that your reader is not South African.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah, but no. Even maybe it's because even in South Africa, there are many people who don't know what mopani worms are.
But I think also, I mean, and that's why for fiction, I just wouldn't. I mean, if I were teaching a class, I would not at all recommend that my students do that, because I also think that often it's about a failure of technique. I think that there are ways in which you use something in a story, and a discerning reader knows what it is, or has a general sense of what it is, without being told. I mean, there's a part of me that just deeply resents the fact that there are many parts of the world where the fiction that comes from there is read as anthropology rather than as literature. And increasingly, that kind of anthropological reading then means that you say something, you're explaining your world rather than inhabiting your world. And there's a part of me that just really, I don't like it. But can we talk about Trevor's mother?
All right, we can end with a discussion of, we'll end on that note, on the discussion of Trevor's mother. What would you like to say about
Trevor's book? Is such a remarkable woman.
Indeed.
Oh my goodness. I want to meet her. I'm in awe of her. Trevor, seriously, I just think you're so fortunate. I read his book and I was so moved. And I have to tell you the particular part, something I found so powerful is when she said, I chose to have you. And I mean, her story, and you know, the fact that she's this, you know, in many ways, ordinary black South African woman who finds something in herself to make these just incredible, extraordinary, beautiful, personal, humane choices in her life, and who decides she wants to have a child. I mean, I remember thinking there's nothing more beautiful to say about the act of reproduction than that. I chose to have you. Right? And you have to excuse me, I have to bring my feminist hat here. There's nothing more beautifully feminist than that. I mean, what is more beautiful than a child who's so wanted?
Right.
And of course, again, I need to bring in my politics. We should have everybody who wants to force people to have to carry unwanted pregnancies. We should have them read Trevor's book.
Huh.
Because because I mean the idea. Trevor's like, all right, don't get me the book, but really, because the idea of a woman making a choice. I mean, that's really what it is. It's like, I chose to have you. And I found her just remarkable on so many levels. I think you're very fortunate.
Thank you
to
very
have been
much.
raised for
I genuinely am.
All right. Well, thank you so much for that, Chimanada, and thank both of you very much for having this conversation with us
Thank
tonight.
you so much.
And
Thank you for
thank
coming
you all
out,
for
everybody.
coming out and listening.